The keys didn't land softly. They skipped across the concrete and stopped at my boots, still warm from Simon Brooks' hand. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He wanted witnesses. "Clean it up," he said, flicking his wrist toward the Bentley. "Or quit." A few people froze. A client pretended to check his phone. Someone laughed, the kind of laugh people use when they're afraid of being next. Simon smiled at the silence he'd created. To him, humiliation was a management style, and I, apparently, was today's example. He saw my work badge, my plain jacket, the keys clipped at my side, in his mind. That was enough to sort me into a category that didn't require eye contact. Facilities, support, disposable. Simon Brooks didn't bother learning names unless they were printed on shareholder reports. I didn't interrupt him. I never do. I run operations, compliance, and asset control for this company, which means my job is to keep things boring, predictable, and legally intact. I make sure the systems work and the rules hold when egos don't. Simon is the opposite. He's power by inheritance, swagger fueled by the last name Brooks, promoted past competence and protected from consequences. He doesn't manage people. He performs dominance. He stepped closer, voice dropping just enough to feel personal. "Don't scratch the rims." The Bentley sat crooked behind him, expensive and impatient, like its owner. He assumed I'd bend down, scoop up the keys, and disappear into the background where he believed I belonged. Something tight pulled behind my ribs. Not rage, control. Rage is loud, control is quiet and patient. I looked at the keys, I looked at the car, and I did nothing. Simon frowned. Confusion flickered. Then irritation. He waited for the ritual obedience that never came. Around us. No one moved. I let the moment stretch just long enough to settle into memory. I didn't pick up the keys. I memorized the car. Because when someone hands you leverage by mistake, the worst thing you can do is rush it. If you're listening right now, I hope you're feeling okay, and if it's been a heavy day, maybe this is your reminder to check in on yourself. Take a second to notice your heartbeat. And if you've been meaning to monitor your blood pressure or book that routine checkup, consider this your gentle nudge. Let me know where you're listening from. Always like knowing who's on the other side of this story. And if this moment resonates with you, stay with me by subscribing, because what Simon did next is where everything truly begins. I learned what erasure feels like the week after the keys hit the ground. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, in meetings where your work is discussed as if it appeared by accident, fully formed, without hands or history behind it. I built the operating backbone of this company over 12 years. I designed the asset controls, standardized vendor contracts, and wrote the compliance workflows that kept us solvent during lean quarters, when departments fought. I stitched processes together. When auditors came knocking, I handed them clean records and calm answers. I wasn't flashy, but nothing moved without passing through something I had built. That history didn't matter once Simon Brooks took the head seat. The meeting was meant to be routine, a progress update for a multi-site expansion project I had overseen from the first feasibility review to final vendor approval. I sat near the wall, where people like me are expected to sit. Simon stood at the screen, relaxed, confident, speaking as though the room belonged to him. "This rollout," he said, tapping the slide, was something I personally pushed through. Streamlined operations, tighter asset control. We moved fast. I felt a small, sharp pressure behind my eyes. Those systems were mine. Every decision on that slide carried my signature somewhere in its paperwork. Simon didn't look at me. He didn't need to. Someone asked about risk exposure. Simon waved it off. "We've got back office support handling the details." Back office support? That was me. A few heads turned in my direction, briefly, then away. No one corrected him. No one said my name. The presentation moved on, dragging my work with it, scrubbing the fingerprints clean. After the meeting, I pulled the project file from the shared system. Or tried to. My name was gone. The lead attribution field had been edited. Simon Brooks now appeared as project owner. The changelog showed it had been updated the night before. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. There was a particular kind of pain in seeing your work survive you. The structure remained. The logic held. Only the acknowledgement had been removed. As if I had never been there. Later that afternoon, Simon passed my desk. He stopped. Just long enough to be deliberate. "You're great at keeping things tidy," he said. "That's important. But leave the strategy to me." I nodded. That was easier than speaking. Anger would have been wasted. I needed clarity, that evening. Alone in my office. I opened the asset and operations contracts tied to the expansion. I wasn't looking for validation. I was checking alignment. That's what I do when something feels wrong. That's when I noticed it. The agreement governing asset use, parking allocations, and operational authority hadn't been opened since it was signed. The system logs were precise. No views, no annotations, no revisions. Simon's name appeared everywhere in the project records, but not once in the contract history. He had taken credit for work he didn't understand, authority he hadn't earned, and systems he had never bothered to read. I closed the file and leaned back, letting the truth settle. Simon Brooks wasn't just erasing me, he was operating blind, mistaking confidence for control, and blind men break expensive things. I sat there longer than planned, not grieving the credit, but measuring the risk he had created. Because ignorance at that level never stays personal for long. It spreads. Quietly, then catastrophically. I didn't rush to act after the meeting. Anger clouds judgment, and I needed precision. What Simon Brooks had done wasn't emotional, it was structural. So I started where structure always reveals the truth, the property rules. The Bentley was still there the next morning, parked diagonally across a striped access zone marked clearly in red. Not a suggestion, not a courtesy space, a legally protected area tied to emergency access and shared use compliance. Simon had left it there overnight, as if the ground itself owed him permission. I stood across the lot and looked at it the way an engineer looks at a cracked beam. Not offended, curious. Cars don't break rules. People do. I pulled the asset use policy from our internal repository. The language was dry, deliberate, and unforgiving. Shared property was governed by allocation schedules, safety easements, and liability triggers, unauthorized use, repeated violations, or interference with designated zones carried escalating consequences, the kind that didn't end with warnings. I cross-checked the lease addendum, then the parking appendix, then the writer Simon had personally approved when his name replaced mine on the project file. He hadn't amended anything. He hadn't even opened it. The Bentley wasn't just parked poorly, it was in breach. I documented the position with photographs, capturing the painted markings, the license plate, the proximity to restricted access. I logged the time. The system time-stamped everything automatically. I didn't annotate, I didn't editorialize. Facts don't need emotion. Inside, I reviewed prior records. Simon had requested exceptions before. Temporary loading access, executive convenience. Each request had been denied or narrowly approved with conditions. Conditions he had ignored. This wasn't a mistake. It was pattern behavior. I checked the enforcement clause again. Repeated violations converted operational issues into personal liability. That line had been written after a lawsuit years earlier. Back when the company still believed preparation was pessimism, I had argued otherwise. The clause stayed. Simon had crossed that line without knowing it existed. By mid-morning, I had a clean file. No speculation, no commentary, just evidence and policy aligned. I closed the folder and sat quietly, letting the implications finish forming. This was the first rule he broke because it was the first rule he noticed. The visible one, the one tied to his ego and his car. Men like Simon don't start with fraud or sabotage. They start with convenience, with small assumptions of immunity. I walked past the Bentley once more on my way inside. A few employees glanced at it, then at me. They were learning, even if they didn't know it yet. Rules mattered again, at least to someone. In my office, I reviewed recent access logs tied to shared resources, storage rooms, electrical panels, vendor scheduling. The entries carried the same signature: Simon Brooks. Override granted. No secondary approval. My screen filled with small infractions, individually survivable, collectively dangerous. I didn't feel satisfaction, I felt clarity. Simon wasn't reckless because he was cruel. He was reckless because he believed the system existed to absorb him. That belief had weight, and weight eventually cracks foundations. I saved the file under a neutral name and locked it. There was no urgency. The Bentley could wait. So could Simon. Violations compound best when left uninterrupted. As I shut down my screen, I understood something important. This wasn't about a car or a parking space. It was about a man who had mistaken inheritance for ownership, visibility for authority. And this was only the first place he'd left evidence behind. Once I started watching Simon Brooks instead of reacting to him. The pattern became impossible to ignore. He didn't ask for access. He took it. He didn't request approval. He treated the company's assets like props in a story where he was always the hero. It began small. An executive vehicle reserved for shared use became his personal shuttle. A conference suite designated for clients turned into his private meeting room. He overrode booking protocols with a smile and a last name that made people step back. Every shortcut came with a justification delivered confidently enough that no one challenged it. Process exists to protect people without power. Simon knew that. He also knew how easily fear dissolves procedure. I watched junior managers freeze when his name appeared on their screens. I saw assistants quietly undo calendar blocks, reroute vendors, and falsify usage labels so his requests looked compliant on paper. They weren't loyal. They were afraid. Fear has a way of laundering bad decisions. Warnings were issued. Carefully worded emails flagged unauthorized usage and reminded everyone of shared asset policy. Simon ignored them and mocked them privately. Guidelines. He called them. As if rules were suggestions meant for slower minds. What bothered me wasn't the arrogance. I had seen arrogance before. What unsettled me was the speed. He was escalating, using more, overriding more, leaving a trail of altered records that pointed back to him every time. One afternoon, I walked through the storage wing and found equipment staged for an off-site event that hadn't been approved. Branded materials, portable displays, hardware pulled from inventory without authorization. The sign-out log bore Simon's name, unchecked and unverified. A coordinator stood nearby, hands clenched at her sides. She wouldn't meet my eyes. He said it was cleared. She whispered, like a confession. I nodded and said nothing. That was becoming my specialty. Later, I reviewed expense reports tied to the same event. The destination wasn't listed. The purpose field was vague: marketing, outreach, visibility, words that meant nothing without context. Simon was careful enough to blur the lines, but not careful enough to stay within them. The real shift came during an investor visit. I wasn't invited. I never am. But my office overlooks the main floor, and I saw Simon moving through the space like he owned it. He gestured broadly, spoke loudly, and pointed to assets he didn't control. "This is ours," he said, sweeping a hand toward infrastructure governed by lease restrictions and shared use clauses. The investors nodded. Cameras flashed. Simon smiled. I felt something cold settle in my chest. He wasn't just misusing assets. He was misrepresenting ownership. He was selling access he didn't have, authority he hadn't earned, certainty built on borrowed ground. Employees stayed silent. They always do when money enters the room. Silence becomes currency. After they left, I pulled the visitor access logs and cross-referenced them with asset permissions. The mismatch was clean. Too clean. Simon had bypassed every safeguard designed to prevent exactly this scenario. I sat at my desk, reviewing the data with detached focus. This wasn't bravado anymore. This was exposure. The kind that doesn't just damage reputations, it triggers consequences. I understood then why the earlier violations mattered, why the Bentley mattered. Simon wasn't careless. He was consistent, and consistency creates records. That night, as I shut down my system, I didn't feel anger. I felt contempt, the kind reserved for people who mistake intimidation for leadership and silence for consent. Simon Brooks was playing landlord with property he didn't own, selling certainty he couldn't guarantee, and dragging everyone beneath him into risk without their permission. And he was doing it, believing no one would stop him. That belief was going to cost him more than he realized. I closed the file and leaned back, letting the irritation sharpen into resolve. Power without permission always ends the same way. It overreaches, then collapses under the weight of its own assumptions. Simon thought fear made him untouchable. He didn't realize fear also makes witnesses. Observant ones. People who remember dates, locations, and names. People who wait. I had stopped seeing Simon as an obstacle. He was evidence in motion, generating proof with every unauthorized step. And the more he flaunted it, the easier it became to map the damage he was creating. This wasn't about confronting him. It was about letting him keep going, confident and unrestrained, until even he couldn't deny what he'd done. I didn't confront Simon Brooks after the investor visit. Confrontation warns people. What I needed was confirmation. So I went back to the one place Simon never bothered to look: the contract itself. The original agreement sat in our secured archive, untouched for years. I remembered the negotiation clearly. Long nights, careful wording, clauses designed not for trust, but for failure. Contracts aren't written for good people. They're written for moments when someone decides rules don't apply to them. I read it slowly, line by line, the way I always do, not skimming for reassurance, but searching for edges, authority, liability, ownership, the sections most executives ignore because they're convinced those pages are for lawyers. Not for them. Simon's name appeared on the signature block of the operational addendum. He had signed it after inheriting oversight authority. The system logs confirmed what I already suspected. No revisions, no follow-up review, no questions asked. He had signed first and assumed understanding would come later. It never does. The clause appeared where I expected it to be, buried beneath neutral language, asset use and recovery, 3 paragraphs that most people read once and forget. I didn't. It outlined the conditions under which company-controlled property could be reclaimed, not seized, reclaimed. The distinction mattered. Unauthorized use, repeated violation of shared asset restrictions, or interference with safety-designated zones triggered the right to recovery without notice. The language was precise. The authority was explicit. Below it sat the personal responsibility provision if misuse resulted in financial exposure, operational disruption, or reputational risk. Liability could extend beyond the corporate shield. Executives love to pretend that shield was absolute. It never is. I turned the page. There it was. Compensation for damages, direct costs, indirect costs, enforcement costs. No cap, no grace period. Written after a previous executive had tried to argue that intent mattered more than outcome. The board had disagreed. So had the courts. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment. Not in relief, but in calculation. Then I cross-referenced the appendix. Parking allocations weren't cosmetic. They were legal designations tied to emergency access and insurance coverage. Vehicles parked in restricted zones weren't just inconveniences. They were liabilities. Repeat violations converted liability into enforceable collateral. That was when the Bentley came back into focus. Simon's car wasn't just expensive. It was registered under a personal holding entity, not the company. That detail mattered more than he knew. The clause didn't distinguish between asset value and asset ego. It covered offending property, regardless of ownership. When used in violation on controlled premises, I opened the property map and overlaid the restricted zones. The Bentley's position from my photographs fell squarely inside the recovery boundary. Not adjacent, not ambiguous. Exact. I felt the advantage settle quietly. Not triumph. Alignment. This wasn't cleverness. It was design. The contract hadn't changed. Simon had simply wandered into its teeth. I reviewed the enforcement sequence. Documentation, notice, recovery, all lawful, all boring, all devastating if activated at the wrong moment for the wrong person. That moment wasn't now. I saved the relevant sections into a separate file and locked it. I didn't share it. I didn't flag it. Knowledge is leverage only when it's quiet. The next morning, I walked past the Bentley again. Simon was nowhere in sight. The car gleamed, confident, parked like an assumption. I wondered how many people had warned him, softly, indirectly, and been ignored. Back in my office, I added one final note to the file. Not about the car, about Simon. Executives who don't read contracts don't fear consequences. They fear embarrassment. They fear loss of status. And when that fear arrives suddenly, they panic. I wasn't preparing an argument. I was preparing inevitability. The clause Simon never read wasn't hidden. It wasn't obscure. It was simply waiting for someone arrogant enough to believe it didn't apply to him. And now I knew something he didn't. The Bentley wasn't a symbol. It was collateral. Simon Brooks didn't explode when he decided to end me. He went quiet. Which was worse. The message came wrapped in corporate calm. Delivered through a meeting request titled, Alignment Discussion. No agenda, no witnesses, just glass walls and a smile rehearsed to look reasonable. He spoke about direction, efficiency, optics. He said the company needed leaders who moved fast and didn't slow momentum with unnecessary caution. That was his word, caution. He never said my name in the accusation, but every sentence pointed at me. Then he folded his hands and said it plainly. My role was under review. Termination was on the table. I didn't argue. Arguing would have given him something to document. I asked one question instead, what policy I had violated. Simon smiled and said policy wasn't the issue. Culture was. That was when I understood this wasn't about performance. It was about removing friction before it could speak. By the time I returned to my desk, my access was already shrinking. The compliance dashboard rejected my credentials. Asset logs required secondary approval. Files I had built and maintained for years suddenly showed read-only warnings. Someone had moved fast, and only Simon had the authority to move that fast. The office felt different immediately. Conversations stopped when I walked past. People glanced at their screens, their phones, the floor anywhere but me. No one said anything unkind. That would have been easier. Silence is harder. Silence means instructions have been given. An HR invite arrived before lunch. Role review. 30 minutes. No details. That's how companies erase people without noise. You walk into a room with your history intact and walk out summarized by a sentence. I spent the afternoon working offline, reconstructing timelines from memory, replaying approvals and signatures in my head. Tension pressed in behind my eyes. Steady and sharp. I wasn't afraid of losing a job. I was afraid of losing the record. If Simon ended me now, the narrative would be his, disruptive, resistant, not a team player. Labels stick longer than truth. Late in the day, Simon passed my desk. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. The message was already delivered. I was alone. I walked the building once before leaving. My badge still worked, but just barely. I could feel the countdown in every locked door and delayed response. Outside, the Bentley sat exactly where it had been, polished and defiant, a reminder that Simon still believed himself untouchable. That night, sleep never settled. I kept running the sequence forward and backward. If I waited, I would be fired quietly and cleanly. If I reacted too early, I would look reckless. Everything I had prepared depended on timing. Too late, and I lost credibility. Too soon, and I lost leverage. The next morning, I opened my calendar and canceled the HR meeting. No explanation, no counterproposal, just a cancellation. It was a small act, but it drew a line. If Simon wanted me gone, he would have to explain why. And once explanations start, evidence follows. I reviewed my notes again, aware that every minute mattered. Simon was counting on isolation to weaken me, on procedure to erase me cleanly. He believed authority moved in one direction, downward from his name. He had never considered what happens when the person you sideline knows where the structure bends. This wasn't bravado, it was math, policies, signatures, timestamps, pieces waiting to be placed. I wasn't stalling. I was compressing the space between action and consequence, narrowing it until there would be no room for interpretation. Whatever happened next would be irreversible, and Simon would not be able to talk his way out of it. I knew then there was no safe middle anymore. If I lost this, I would lose my career and my name with it. So I stopped trying to survive the process. The choice had already been made, and from that moment forward, I accepted that survival would require precision, patience, and the willingness to let the truth detonate at the right time. I didn't raise my voice when it happened. I didn't call security, didn't threaten, didn't negotiate. I followed the sequence exactly as it had been written. Documentation first, notice second, recovery last. That order mattered. Emotion would only complicate what the contract already allowed. The request went out early, routed through the property compliance channel. No language that could be argued, no adjectives, just facts, repeated violations, restricted zone, documented risk. I attached the photographs and the map overlay. Then I waited. The tow operator arrived without drama. He checked the paperwork, nodded once, and set to work. Chains locked into place. The winch tightened, and the Bentley shifted from confidence to compliance. Metal protested, tires resisted, then surrendered. It was efficient, loud, final. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not joy, release. People stopped to watch. No one spoke. This wasn't a scene. It was enforcement. The driver handed me a receipt and a timestamp. I signed. The Bentley was lifted away, still shining, still expensive, no longer untouchable, inside. The phone started ringing. Simon Brooks called twice. I didn't answer. Then his assistant. Then a number I didn't recognize. I let them stack. Silence does important work when people expect panic. The message finally came through as accusation. My car was stolen. I was sabotaging him. He was calling the police. I forwarded the notice of recovery and the clause reference. No commentary, just the page number. By the time Simon realized what had happened, the Bentley was already off-site. Recovery law doesn't wait for understanding. That was the point. He thought force created leverage. Paper does. He stormed through the lobby, demanding answers. He didn't look at me at first. When he did, confusion cracked into fear. "You can't," he said. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The documents spoke clearly enough. Someone mentioned theft. I corrected them once. "Recovery," I said. The word settled the room. Simon's voice climbed. He demanded reversal, threatened consequences, promised retaliation. I watched the color drain from his face as he realized the system wasn't listening to him anymore. When he left, the space felt lighter, not victorious, clear. The rule had been applied. Nothing more, nothing less. That was the relief. Control restored, not seized. Later, I received confirmation, storage secured, access logged, fees pending. I filed the receipt where it belonged. One action, complete. That evening, I learned Simon thought the car had been stolen. He told people I had crossed a line. He hadn't seen the line until it closed behind him. Panic changes people. It strips confidence down to impulse. Simon had never operated without momentum before. Now it was gone. I didn't celebrate. I prepared. Repossession was not an ending. It was a signal. The first consequence had landed. More would follow, because panic makes mistakes faster. I shut down my screen and let the quiet return. Simon Brooks believed something had been taken from him. What he didn't understand was that this was only the beginning. The law had finally entered the room. And it wasn't leaving. Not for him. Not now. Not after everything he had ignored. The Bentley had been the loudest proof, but it wouldn't be the last. I gathered my notes, steady again. Knowing control had shifted permanently. He had mistaken silence for weakness. Today, silence had answered him. Tomorrow would bring calls, meetings, explanations he wasn't ready to give. I would stay procedural, calm, exact. The record would grow, line by line, each entry anchored to a decision he made. People would begin to speak once they saw consequences apply evenly. Fear would loosen its grip, replaced by memory and proof. That is how order returns. Quietly, without speeches. I didn't need revenge. I needed accuracy. The difference matters. When this ended, it would be because the rules held, not because anyone shouted. Simon would learn that authority fades, but paper remembers everything, especially signatures, locations, and choices made in plain sight. That lesson would cost him dearly, even if he never admitted it aloud. And when he finally understood, the damage would already be irreversible, documented, witnessed, and impossible to undo by charm alone. I didn't hear about Simon's counterattack from the board. I heard it from the hallways. Conversations dropped when I passed. Emails stopped copying me. Someone closed a door that used to stay open. Chaos spreads faster than truth, and Simon was feeding it deliberately. By the afternoon, rumors had shape and language. I was disgruntled. I was resistant. I was undermining leadership. None of it surprised me. Simon had lost his symbol, and men like him replace symbols with noise. Noise confuses witnesses. Confusion buys time. Time was what he needed most. Everyone sensed something ugly moving just beneath procedure. Simon didn't wait for facts. He went straight to character. In a closed board call, he framed me as a problem employee, someone bitter about losing relevance. He said I resisted change, hid behind policy, slowed innovation. He suggested I was retaliating emotionally. That word mattered. Emotional. It implied unreliability. He warned them I might escalate, leak information, damage morale. Then he threatened lawsuits, not against the company, but against me personally. A calculated move meant to isolate me further and make silence look like guilt. It worked on fear, not evidence. And fear spreads quickly when leadership lacks backbone. I was invited to none of these conversations. That exclusion was intentional. Simon needed my absence to define me, if I spoke. I'd confirm his narrative. If I defended myself, I'd appear reactive. I understood the trap immediately. Desperation always overplays its hand. And Simon was desperate now. His voice grew louder, sharper, more reckless. He sent long emails demanding immediate action. He CC'd lawyers too early. He named enemies instead of issues. Every message revealed more about him than me. And I let them accumulate untouched. Silence preserved contrast. And contrast exposes instability better than protest in the end. Simon requested an emergency review, insisting I be removed pending investigation. He said the environment felt unsafe. He said staff were uncomfortable. He said I was undermining trust. None of it came with specifics. That omission mattered. Boards listen differently when details are missing. Still, his pressure created confusion. People whispered. Managers hesitated. I felt the isolation closing in, heavy and deliberate. This was the moment he expected me to break, to plead, to explain. Instead, I documented everything and said nothing, letting his urgency speak for itself. Each accusation stretched thinner with repetition and panic, visible to everyone watching. The legal threat followed predictably. Simon's counsel sent a letter warning of defamation and damages. The tone was aggressive, hurried, full of assumptions. It accused me of misconduct without citing events. That mattered too. Real cases are slow. Strong cases are careful. This was neither. It was intimidation disguised as process. I read it once and archived it. Responding would have legitimized it. Silence kept the burden where it belonged. Every unreturned threat forced Simon to escalate, and escalation exposes motive faster than denial ever could. His fear became procedural noise the board could finally hear clearly and without filters. I stayed invisible by design. I attended meetings silently. I answered only direct questions with facts. I didn't defend myself socially or professionally. Simon filled that vacuum with emotion. He interrupted. He accused. He contradicted himself. His desperation shifted the room. People stopped nodding. They started taking notes. That's when I knew the balance had tipped. Authority doesn't need volume. Truth doesn't rush. I watched Simon unravel in real time, and my restraint became the sharpest contrast he could not overcome. Silence framed his behavior. Highlighting instability words alone cannot hide under pressure from witnesses who had been watching quietly. By the end of the week, Simon had said too much. He had threatened too broadly and accused too vaguely. The board didn't need my defense anymore. They had his. I never interrupted the collapse. I let it proceed at his pace. When power panics, it documents itself. My silence wasn't weakness. It was containment. Simon believed he was fighting me. In truth, he was fighting his own reflection, amplified by pressure and stripped of restraint. For everyone finally paying attention, the chaos he created became his testimony. I only ensured it remained uninterrupted and fully visible until consequences arrived. The shift didn't announce itself with applause. It arrived quietly, carried on forwarded emails and calendar invites that no longer included Simon Brooks's voice at the center. My silence had done its work. Now it's time for evidence to speak. I didn't present everything at once. That would have looked theatrical. Instead, I sent a single message to the board's secure channel, attaching 3 documents and nothing else. No commentary, no framing. Just material Simon had produced himself. The first was an email Simon had sent weeks earlier, marked urgent, instructing facilities to bypass approval protocols for asset use during an investor walkthrough. He had written confidently, assuming speed justified authority. His name sat cleanly at the bottom, signature intact. He hadn't copied legal. He hadn't asked permission. He had commanded. The second document was a signed authorization form, bearing Simon's personal signature, approving operational changes tied to restricted property. He had initialed each page without reading the conditions attached. Those initials mattered. They transferred responsibility from abstraction to individual, from company to person. The third item was a transcript excerpt. Simon's own words, recorded during a planning session he believed was private. He had joked about owning the place, about how rules slowed real leaders down, about how investors liked confidence more than paperwork. He had laughed. Others had laughed nervously. The recording had been archived automatically. Systems remember what people forget. I waited. Responses came slowly at first. Clarifying questions, requests for context. I answered only what was asked. Always briefly. Always with references, page numbers, dates, times. I let the material guide the conversation. Then the tone shifted. A board member asked why Simon had authorized changes beyond his scope. Another asked why legal hadn't been notified. Someone pointed out that the asset recovery clause applied directly to the actions outlined. The room, virtual as it was, grew colder. Process replaced opinion. When Simon joined the call, he sounded confident for exactly 30 seconds. Then the questions started. He denied intent. He blamed speed. He claimed misunderstanding. The documents disagreed with him calmly and thoroughly. He tried to reframe it as initiative. That failed. He tried to say everyone did it. That failed too. The signature didn't lie. The email chain didn't bend. His own words echoed back without context. Stripped of charm, I said very little. I didn't need to. Every attempt Simon made to explain only highlighted how little he understood the boundaries he had crossed. Then the CEO spoke. Not loudly, not angrily. He asked one question. Why hadn't Simon brought these decisions forward for review? Simon hesitated. The pause was long enough to matter. There was no good answer left. That was the moment the protection cracked. The CEO didn't defend him. He didn't attack either. He simply stopped intervening. Silence. This time wasn't strategy. It was concession. The board moved quickly after that. They didn't vote yet. They didn't announce outcomes. But the language changed. Words like exposure, liability, and individual responsibility replaced innovation and momentum. Simon's name appeared next to risk, not leadership, when the call ended. I closed my laptop and sat still. The reversal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The truth had entered the record under Simon's own name, in his own handwriting, using his own voice. He had built the case himself. I had only assembled it. I understood then that the shift was complete. The board no longer needed persuasion. They had clarity. Simon's authority drained quietly, replaced by procedure. He would still argue, still posture, still threaten, but the ground beneath him had changed. Evidence does that. It alters gravity. I gathered my notes, precise and intact, knowing the next phase would require patience. This wasn't victory. It was inversion. The system had recognized its own breach and corrected course. Simon Brooks had walked himself into consequence. I had simply opened the door and stepped aside. What followed would not depend on me anymore. It would move forward because truth had been logged, verified, and acknowledged by people who could no longer ignore it. When the room turned cold, no one moved. Screens stayed lit. Notebooks stayed open. But the air shifted, subtle and unmistakable. This was no longer a discussion. It was an assessment, and everyone in it felt the weight of consequence settling into place. The CEO spoke last. He had listened through the evidence without interruption. His face unreadable, hands folded as if patience were a discipline. When he finally addressed Simon Brooks, his voice carried neither anger nor affection. It carried calculation. He asked whether Simon understood the scope of what had been presented. Simon started to answer quickly, then slowed. Sensing the ground had changed beneath him, the questions that followed were precise. Why approvals were bypassed, why ownership was misrepresented, why liability had been assumed without authority. Simon's responses thinned with each sentence. He blamed speed, momentum, trust. None of those words met the standard in the room. The board didn't argue. They documented. Silence stretched. Not awkward. Final. The CEO leaned forward slightly. He said Simon had become a risk to the company, not because of ambition, but because of disregard. He said risk was something the board could not afford. Then he used the word that ended it: suspension. Effective immediately. Access revoked. Authority paused pending review. Simon protested. He said this was an overreaction. He said I had manipulated the process. His voice rose, sharp and brittle. No one responded. Security protocols activated quietly. A message flashed, confirming his credentials had been disabled. The system did not care how loud he spoke. I watched him realize it in stages. First confusion, then disbelief, then fear. Power doesn't vanish all at once. It drains, and when it does, it leaves behind a soundless vacuum. The CEO turned to me then. He asked me to stay. Not as a courtesy, as a necessity. He said asset control required continuity. He said oversight needed someone who understood exposure, not optics. The invitation was measured, deliberate. It wasn't an apology. It was acknowledgement. I took my seat without comment. The room adjusted around that decision immediately. Questions shifted toward stabilization, toward containment, toward repair. My answers were factual, unemotional, grounded in record and process. Authority followed naturally. It always does when people trust accuracy more than charisma. Simon sat silent now, watching something transfer that he could not interrupt. The board discussed interim controls. They discussed audits. They discussed next steps as if he were already absent. In effect, he was. When the meeting ended, no one lingered. There were no speeches, no gloating, just movement, purposeful and controlled. The CEO paused as others filed out. He said this was difficult. He said family complicated leadership. He did not ask forgiveness. He accepted responsibility. Outside the room, Simon waited. He looked smaller without an audience. He didn't speak to me. He didn't have anything left to say. His power had depended on permission he no longer had. I walked back to my office, aware of the shift settling across the building. Systems respond quickly when clarity arrives. People breathe easier. Processes realign. Order doesn't announce itself, it simply resumes. That day ended without celebration. Justice rarely feels triumphant. It feels cold, precise, and irreversible. Power had changed hands, not through force, but through fact and facts. Once recognized, do not return what they take. I stayed late, not to savor the outcome, but to secure continuity. Access lists were reviewed, temporary controls set, and notifications drafted with neutral language. I spoke with legal briefly, then compliance, then facilities, ensuring nothing drifted into improvisation. The building exhaled as routines returned. Somewhere behind closed doors, Simon was calling lawyers, searching for leverage that no longer existed. I didn't think about him. I focused on assets, records, and people. Cold justice doesn't linger. It proceeds forward, always forward, until stability replaced spectacle and authority returned to its proper, accountable place again now. Simon Brooks unraveled quietly at first. The suspension email went out before noon, and by mid-afternoon, his calendar was empty. Meetings vanished. Access disappeared. His name stopped opening doors. Power leaves marks when it goes. And Simon carried every one of them on his face as he moved through the building without direction. He lost the Bentley the same way he lost authority through paperwork. Recovery fees accumulated. Storage notices followed. He argued with clerks, then lawyers, then silence. The car became an absence everyone noticed. What had once announced him now documented him. A luxury reduced to inventory. Reputation fell faster. Whispers hardened into conclusions. Investors pulled back. Partners asked for assurances no one could give. People who had laughed at his jokes avoided his calls. Confidence turned brittle when it wasn't reinforced by permission. Simon tried to perform certainty, but the audience was gone. The company shifted around him. Interim leadership was appointed. Controls tightened. Audits scheduled. The word restructure entered every conversation. Heavy and unavoidable. Departments that had bent for Simon straightened cautiously, as if testing gravity again. Systems corrected themselves once pressure lifted. I watched from a distance, focused on stability. My role expanded without ceremony. Decisions came across my desk that had once bypassed it. I approved access, paused contracts, and reset boundaries with measured language. The work mattered more than the moment. Order doesn't care who restores it. Simon requested a meeting, not formally, through intermediaries, then directly. His message was short, stripped of bravado. He wanted clarity. He wanted to explain. Desperation has a way of compressing language. We met in a small room without glass. No audience, no recorders. He looked tired, smaller, as if gravity had finally reached him. He spoke about misunderstandings, about intentions, about family pressure. He asked what would happen next. I told him the truth. His future depended on the board, the findings, and the record he had created. I did not offer comfort. Comfort would have been dishonest. He asked if I would recommend leniency. That was the first time he acknowledged my position without contempt. I didn't answer immediately. Power had shifted fully now. Not symbolically. Practically. The company needed resolution, not mercy. Reputational risk required distance. Operational trust required consequences. I told him my recommendation would reflect that reality. Simon nodded slowly. He understood then that he had lost more than assets. He had lost narrative. His name would be attached to a lesson no one wanted to repeat. When he left, the silence returned, heavier but clean. The collapse was complete. There was nothing left to contest, only outcomes. I returned to my office and finalized restructuring steps. Notices drafted, timeline set, authority clarified. Somewhere, Simon was packing a box, selling a story that no longer convinced anyone. I didn't feel satisfaction, I felt finality, the kind that closes accounts and ends chapters. His fall wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. That's how everything truly ends. It would follow him beyond this building. Recruiters would pause, advisors would hedge, friends would distance themselves politely. Consequences rarely shout. They whisper persistently. I documented final approvals and closed the file. Aware the authority rested with me now. Not as revenge, but stewardship. The board expected judgment grounded in risk, not emotion. I accepted that weight without ceremony. Simon had forced a reckoning and received it. My task was to ensure the lesson endured, embedded in policy, process, and memory, so no one could mistake privilege for permission again. That responsibility marked the true end of his power and the beginning of accountable order for everyone involved. The building felt different once the paperwork cleared. Not quieter, just steadier, like a system returned to its baseline after a long overload. Authority had been reassigned, controls reactivated, and permissions aligned with reality. I signed the final authorization that morning, reclaiming operational control formally, not symbolically. No announcements followed. Stability doesn't need applause. With Simon Brooks removed from decision paths, routines began repairing themselves. Meetings started on time. Requests came through proper channels. People stopped looking over their shoulders before answering questions. The fear that had bent behavior loosened, replaced by something more durable than loyalty predictability. That's what order looks like when it works. I reviewed asset registers, confirmed custody, and closed recovery accounts. The Bentley paperwork finalized without fanfare. Fees settled, storage released. It was no longer a story, just a transaction resolved. Symbols lose power when reduced to line items. The board ratified interim governance and asked me to continue overseeing controls through transition. I accepted without comment. Stewardship isn't glamorous. It's maintenance. It's making sure yesterday's mistakes don't become tomorrow's habits. The company didn't need a hero. It needed gravity restored. As days passed, Simon's presence faded. His name stopped surfacing in conversations. Decisions no longer referenced what he might think. That silence wasn't cruelty. It was consequence. Relevance doesn't survive without permission. I walked the property once more, not to inspect, but to observe. Systems hummed, people worked. No one rushed to impress. No one flinched. That calm was earned, not granted. Justice, when applied correctly, doesn't thrill, it reassures. The CEO stopped by briefly. He thanked me for steadiness and said the company would recover. I agreed. Companies are resilient when accountability returns. Family complicates leadership, but process outlasts sentiment. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. At my desk, I archived the final file and locked it. The record was complete, clean, and permanent. I felt satisfaction then. Not the sharp kind, but the deep certainty that comes from alignment. The rules had held. People had learned. No one needed to be reminded again. I shut down my screen and stood, listening to the building breathe. Control wasn't mine because I demanded it. It was mine because I respected it. That distinction mattered more than any title. I left knowing this chapter was closed. What remained would move forward on principle. not ego, and if anyone ever forgot where power truly comes from, the record would still be there, waiting. Simon Brooks once threw his keys at my feet and expected obedience. He taught me something instead, something he never understood himself. Some lessons stay with a place long after the people leave. This one settled into policies, checklists, and quiet conversations that corrected behavior without humiliation. New leaders asked better questions. Old habits lost cover. The system remembered what arrogance forgot, and memory became protection. I didn't need to speak about what happened. The structure spoke for me. When accountability becomes routine, drama loses oxygen. That was the real recovery, the kind that prevents repetition instead of merely punishing failure. It reshaped expectations, strengthened trust, and ensured consequences followed actions consistently, without favoritism or noise across teams and decisions everywhere. If you stayed until the end of this story, thank you so much. It means a great deal to us. And looking back, the lesson I learned is simple. True power doesn't need to be loud. It's shown in how we maintain our value when we're looked down upon. Where did you hear this story from? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found it meaningful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join me on more stories. 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 On more stories.